He thought the Mexican worker didn't understand, until he spoke. Nico stood silent as they laughed, assuming he didn't understand a single word. He was just a Mexican worker in the corner, hands dirty, eyes down, easy to ignore. They talked freely around him about pay cuts, shortcuts, things that could ruin a life. Then Nico heard his own name said out loud, followed by a joke that wasn't meant for him to catch. His grip tightened on the tool in his hand. His accent, his silence, his patience, all carefully chosen, because Nico understood everything. The real question is, why had he been waiting for this exact moment to speak? Nico cleared his throat softly, a sound so small it barely registered as an interruption. The men paused out of reflex rather than respect, eyes flicking toward him with mild annoyance. He spoke calmly, asking a procedural question about the figures on the page, as if nothing unusual had happened. The question was precise enough to demand an answer, and vague enough to seem harmless. One of the managers responded automatically, slipping into explanation mode without thinking. Nico listened, nodding once, encouraging the flow the way he always did. As the explanation continued, the room subtly shifted, attention tightening around the exchange. Something old and practiced stirred inside Nico as he recognized the door opening. He followed with another question, this one about compliance timelines and reporting chains. It was a kind of detail most people avoided because it revealed accountability too clearly. The men glanced at each other, irritation now edged with uncertainty. Nico kept his tone neutral, his accent intact, his posture deferential. He watched relief flicker across their faces as they decided he was only trying to do his job better. That misjudgment settled over the table like a blanket, warm and blinding. Nico had learned that clarity frightened people more than confrontation ever could. He let them feel safe enough to keep talking. As they spoke, Nico mentally aligned their words with policies he had studied late at night. He had memorized them not out of ambition, but out of necessity. Knowledge had been his quiet insurance policy in places where protection was selective. Each shortcut they described landed cleanly against a rule they were violating. He felt no triumph in this, only a steady confirmation. The room smelled faintly of coffee and toner, mundane details anchoring the moment. Nico wondered if they noticed how easily truth assembled itself when no one tried to stop it. He suspected they would only realize later when it was too late. One manager laughed again, dismissing a concern with a wave of his hand. Nico asked him to repeat the point, pretending he had not heard it clearly. The repetition stripped the comment of its humor, leaving only its recklessness exposed. Silence followed, heavier this time, charged with self-awareness. Nico felt a shift inside himself, a loosening where tension used to live. He was no longer bracing for damage, only observing consequence. The men began choosing their words more carefully, though they did not know why. That change told Nico more than any confession could. He thought briefly of his father again, not as a warning, but as a witness. This was a conversation that had never been corrected back then. Nico felt grief pass through him quietly, acknowledged and released. The present demanded his full attention now, not memory. He asked about safety reviews, citing a date that made one man stiffen. The man corrected him, then hesitated, realizing correction was worse. Nico nodded as if grateful, though his pulse had finally begun to quicken. He recognized the moment as the point of no return. The room's power dynamic shifted almost imperceptibly, like a change in air pressure. Nico was still seated, still soft-spoken, but no longer invisible. One of the men studied him more closely, searching for something he had missed. Nico met his gaze briefly, then looked away, giving nothing. That restraint unsettled them more than defiance would have. He understood now why he had waited all these years. Patience had sharpened him into an instrument rather than a shield. The realization steadied him. A folder was slid across the table, offered without ceremony. Nico opened it slowly, aware of every eye tracking his hands. Inside were numbers that confirmed what he already knew. He kept his expression neutral, though something inside him hardened. This was no longer about rumor or implication. It was documented, traceable, undeniable. Nico closed the folder carefully, as if respecting its weight. The men mistook that care for obedience. He asked one final question, this one about signatures. The answer came too fast, rehearsed and careless. Nico thanked him, his voice still even, still polite. The meeting began to dissolve, chairs scraping, papers gathering. Relief returned to the room, premature and fragile. Nico remained seated as they stood, reclaiming space without announcement. He felt the strange calm deepen, settling like a decision honored. No one noticed that the balance had already shifted. When the room finally emptied, Nico was alone with the hum of the lights. He exhaled slowly, allowing the tension its exit. His hands were steady now, his mind clear. What he held was not revenge, but responsibility. He understood the cost of what came next and accepted it. Silence returned, but it was no longer imposed. This silence belonged to him. It felt different, heavier, chosen. Nico stood and gathered his things, moving with deliberate calm. He knew exactly who he needed to speak to next. The waiting had ended, replaced by a narrow, irreversible path. For the first time, he did not feel small inside the building. He felt visible in a way that could not be undone. As he reached the door, doubt flickered briefly, then passed. Some truths demanded a witness willing to step forward. Nico realized he had already become that witness. Nico did not go back to the floor immediately, choosing instead to walk the long corridor toward the administrative wing, where the walls were cleaner and the voices lower. Each step felt deliberate, as if he were retracing a path he had already walked his mind many times. The building carried on around him, indifferent to the internal shift that had just taken place. He passed familiar faces who nodded without curiosity, still seeing him as part of the background machinery. Nico returned the gestures politely, guarding what he now carried with practiced restraint. This was not the moment for exposure, only for positioning. He understood that momentum, once wasted, rarely returned. He stopped outside a glass office where a woman named Laura worked, someone whose role bridged policy and paperwork in ways most people underestimated. Laura had been kind to him in small, forgettable ways over the years, the kind of kindness that suggested she noticed more than she said. Nico waited until she finished her call, watching her reflection rather than her face. When she finally looked up, surprise flickered, followed by cautious curiosity. He introduced his reason for being there as a clarification request. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. Laura gestured for him to sit, her professionalism sliding easily into place. Nico recognized the opening and stepped through it carefully. As he spoke, he watched Laura's expression more than he listened to his own words. He framed his concerns as questions, his knowledge as confusion, allowing her to guide the conversation while unknowingly confirming his understanding. Laura's tone shifted gradually, her answers growing slower as implications assembled themselves. Nico felt the room tighten, not with accusation, but with recognition. He had learned that people trusted discoveries they believed they made themselves. Laura leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing as she revisited her own assumptions. The silence between them carried weight. Neither of them rushed to break. Laura asked where he had heard these things, and Nico answered honestly without revealing more than necessary. He spoke of meetings, of numbers, of procedures spoken aloud without caution. Laura nodded, her pen tapping once against her desk before stopping. That small gesture told Nico more than words could. She was calculating, not dismissing. He felt a strange alignment, a sense that his patience had finally intersected with someone else's integrity. The realization was both comforting and dangerous. She asked him why he was bringing this to her now. Nico hesitated just long enough to make the answer feel considered rather than rehearsed. He told her he had waited because he needed to be certain, and because certainty required time. Laura studied him openly now, reassessing the quiet man she thought she knew. Nico did not fill the space with explanation, allowing her to sit with the discomfort of redefinition. He knew that being seen differently was often the first consequence of speaking up. He accepted it without flinching. Laura stood and closed the office door, a small but significant act. She lowered her voice, asking questions Nico had not expected, about documentation, witnesses, patterns. Nico answered calmly, his memory precise, his tone unchanged. Each response added weight to the room, grounding speculation into structure. Laura's professionalism remained intact, but something personal had entered her posture. Nico recognized it as the moment someone realizes neutrality is no longer possible. He felt a surge of respect for her that surprised him. As the conversation deepened, Nico felt the cost of his decisions settle more fully. He thought of his routine, his anonymity, the safety of being overlooked. All of it was quietly dissolving, replaced by uncertainty that could not be undone. Yet beneath that uncertainty was a steadiness he had never known before. He was no longer reacting to the world, but shaping his place within it. The shift was subtle, but irreversible. Nico realized he was grieving his old invisibility even as he stepped beyond it. Laura finally thanked him, her voice measured but sincere. She explained the next steps, the reviews, the processes that would follow. Nico listened without illusion, understanding that systems moved slowly and often resisted correction. He did not expect immediate justice or recognition. What he wanted was interruption, a break in the pattern that had harmed so many quietly. Laura promised discretion, though they both knew discretion had limits. Nico nodded, accepting that risk as part of the price. When he left her office, the hallway felt different, narrower somehow. He could sense eyes lingering longer than before, though nothing had visibly changed. Nico wondered how much of that was perception and how much was reality. He reminded himself that fear often exaggerated its own importance. Still, he remained alert, aware that silence once broken could never be fully reclaimed. The building no longer felt neutral to him. It felt watchful. As he returned to his work area, Nico noticed how easily routines resumed around him. Machines hummed, conversations drifted, schedules held. The world did not pause for moments of moral choice. That indifference steadied him rather than discouraged him. He understood now that meaningful change rarely announced itself. It moved quietly, carried by people willing to endure discomfort without spectacle. Nico resumed his tasks, hands steady, expression unchanged. Yet beneath the surface, everything had shifted. The waiting had transformed into movement, and there was no turning back. The days that followed did not erupt the way Nico half expected them to. There were no sudden confrontations, no closed-door accusations, no dramatic reversals of fortune. Instead, there was a subtle tightening of the environment, a sense that something invisible had begun to circulate through the building. Conversations lowered when he passed. Glances lingered a fraction too long before looking away. Nico moved through it with the same measured calm he always had, though internally he tracked each shift with heightened awareness. He understood that systems resisted exposure not with force, but with delay. Waiting, he reminded himself, was something he knew how to do. Laura avoided him in public, a necessary distance that spoke more loudly than acknowledgement. Their communication became procedural, routed through email stripped of tone and personality. Nico read between the lines easily, recognizing caution rather than betrayal. He appreciated her discipline, even as it reinforces isolation. The loneliness that accompanied speaking up settled into him slowly, not as regret, but as a quiet mourning for simplicity he had lost. He had chosen clarity over comfort, and clarity demanded space. Nico accepted that trade without romanticizing it. On the floor, the men from the meeting behaved differently around him. Their jokes stopped short. Their instructions grew formal, their smiles thinner. One of them, a supervisor named Mark, tried friendliness as a test, asking Nico about his family in a voice too casual to be sincere. Nico answered politely, offering nothing that could be used or misunderstood. Mark nodded, unsettled by the lack of access, and retreated. Nico recognized the pattern as a search for leverage disguised as concern. He felt no satisfaction in denying it, only necessity. At home, the change followed him in ways he had not anticipated. He slept lightly, waking to small sounds that had never registered before. His wife noticed, asking if work was getting harder, and he told her only that things were changing. She studied him with the quiet perception that had drawn him to her years earlier, sensing truth without demanding it. Nico felt a familiar guilt rise, the cost of protection through silence. He reminded himself that some truths required the right moment, even within a marriage. Still, the distance weighed on him. A week later, Laura sent a message requesting a brief meeting. The wording was careful, neutral, but Nico felt the underlying tension immediately. When he arrived, she looked more tired than before, her composure intact but strained. She explained that an internal review had begun, framed as routine but focused enough to confirm his concerns. Nico listened, his face giving nothing away, though relief moved quietly through him. This was the interruption he had hoped for, fragile but real. He thanked her without ceremony, aware that gratitude itself could be misinterpreted. Laura warned him that scrutiny had a way of exposing more than intended. People were already asking how he knew what he knew. Nico nodded, unsurprised. He had expected suspicion to follow disclosure like a shadow. What he had not expected was how little it frightened him. He told Laura he understood the risks and was prepared for them. She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing something unsaid. Then she told him that his name had been mentioned again, this time in a different tone. The shift unsettled her more than hostility would have. As Nico left her office, he felt the weight of being named in rooms he could not enter. He understood how narratives formed, how easily intent could be rewritten by those with power. The thought did not paralyze him, but it sharpened his focus. He began documenting everything more carefully, dates and interactions recorded with quiet diligence. He had learned that memory alone was too vulnerable to distortion. The act of writing steadied him, transforming anxiety into structure. Each entry felt like an anchor. The workplace grew colder, not overtly hostile, but drained of warmth. Nico's tasks remained the same, but oversight increased, mistakes scrutinized with new intensity. He performed his work flawlessly, not out of pride, but out of strategy. He knew competence was his only shield now. The pressure did not break him, but it narrowed his world, compressing it into a series of controlled responses. He missed the ease of being overlooked, even as he understood it had never truly protected him. The realization brought a quiet bitterness he had to manage carefully. One evening, as he prepared to leave, Mark stopped him near the exit. His voice was measured, his words chosen with care, but the message beneath them was clear. He asked Nico if everything was all right, if there was anything he wanted to share. Nico met his gaze steadily, answering that he was just doing his job. Mark smiled thinly, the exchange unresolved. Nico walked away with his heart steady but alert. The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Nico knew then that the silence around him was no longer ignorance. It was waiting. The investigation moved forward in increments so small they were almost invisible to anyone not watching for them. Audits were scheduled, postponed, then rescheduled under different names. Consultants appeared briefly, asking narrow questions before disappearing again. Nico observed it all from the margins, aware that the process was as much about containment as correction. He felt himself becoming an unspoken reference point, a variable others tried to account for without acknowledging. The awareness was isolating, but also confirmed that his actions had mattered. Change rarely arrived cleanly, but it left traces. Rumors began to circulate, distorted versions of the truth shaped by fear and self-preservation. Some said Nico was angling for a promotion, others that he had misunderstood instructions due to background. He heard these things secondhand, carried in by co-workers who did not know what to make of them. Nico responded with neutrality, refusing to defend himself against stories that thrived on reaction. He understood that engaging would only legitimize the narrative he was being assigned. Silence, once a shield against erasure, now became a refusal to be rewritten. The distinction mattered. At home, the strain finally breached the careful boundaries he had maintained. His wife asked him directly if he was in trouble, her voice steady but her eyes searching. Nico considered deflection, then chose honesty measured enough to protect them both. He told her that he had spoken up about something that mattered and that there might be consequences. She listened without interruption, absorbing the weight of what he was not saying. When she reached for his hand, the simple contact grounded him more than any reassurance could have. Her quiet support became his anchor. She did not ask him to stop or to reconsider, and that restraint felt like trust. Instead, she asked him what he needed to stay steady. The question surprised him with its clarity. Nico realized how rarely he had been asked that, how often his role had been to endure without acknowledgement. He told her he needed time and patience, and perhaps forgiveness for the distance he could not entirely close. She nodded, accepting the terms without conditions. The exchange fortified him in ways he had not anticipated. At work, Laura's communications grew more guarded. Updates came less frequently, and when they did, they were stripped of detail. Nico understood that the process had moved beyond her direct control. That knowledge carried both relief and unease. He had trusted her judgment, and now he had to trust the system she had engaged. The shift forced him to confront the limits of his influence. Letting go was harder than speaking up had been. One afternoon, Nico was called into a meeting with Human Resources. The request was phrased as routine, but the timing made its purpose unmistakable. He entered the room prepared, his documentation organized, his demeanor calm. The questions were polite, almost friendly, circling his observations without naming them. Nico answered honestly, choosing precision over emotion. He sensed the careful balancing act underway, the attempt to resolve the issue without destabilizing the structure. The realization did not surprise him. The meeting ended without resolution, but with a promise of follow-up. Nico left feeling neither vindicated nor defeated. He recognized the moment for what it was, a test of endurance rather than integrity. He had expected pressure, and now it had arrived in a form designed to exhaust rather than confront. The strategy was familiar, and that familiarity steadied him. He reminded himself that clarity was not dependent on outcome. He had already crossed the threshold that mattered. In the weeks that followed, the workplace continued its slow recalibration. Some procedures changed quietly. Others were announced with language that avoided responsibility. Nico noticed improvements that would reduce harm, even if their origins were never acknowledged. That partial success carried a complicated satisfaction. He knew the men who had made the decisions might never face public consequence. The injustice of that reality lingered, but it did not erase the lives that would now be safer. Nico held on to that. One evening, Laura called him unexpectedly. Her voice was lower than usual, her words carefully chosen. She told him that the investigation had confirmed significant violations and that changes would be formalized soon. She also told him, gently, that his role would never be officially recognized. The system would correct itself without naming its catalyst. Nico closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the finality of that truth. He thanked her, meaning it more than she knew. When the call ended, he sat in silence, feeling the weight of invisibility return in a new form. This time it was chosen, and it carried a different meaning. The formal announcement came on a Monday morning, delivered through an email that framed the changes as proactive improvements rather than necessary corrections. Nico read it carefully, noting the language that softened responsibility and redirected credit. New safety protocols were introduced, oversight committees named, and a commitment to transparency declared without reference to what had preceded it. The message was met with polite approval across the floor, a collective nod that allowed everyone to move on without reflection. Nico felt the strange duality of the moment settle into him. The knowledge that something important had shifted without anyone acknowledging the force that had caused it. He closed the email and returned to his work, the routine grounding him. The world had adjusted itself just enough to preserve its image. Mark was reassigned shortly after, his departure framed as a lateral move rather than a consequence. The men from the meeting no longer occupied the same positions, dispersed quietly into other departments. No one spoke openly about why, and no one asked Nico what he thought. He understood the silence as a mutual agreement to forget selectively. The absence of confrontation left him with unresolved tension, a sense that justice had been diluted into something palatable. Yet the floor was safer now, the shortcut sealed off by procedure. That outcome mattered, even if the narrative erased its origins. Nico noticed how his co-workers interacted with him differently, not with hostility, but with caution edged by respect. Some asked him questions about policy, about reporting channels, about rights they had never considered before. He answered when he could, careful not to position himself as an authority. He had no desire to become a symbol or a spokesperson. Still, he felt the subtle shift in how he was perceived, less invisible than before, but not entirely visible either. It was an uncomfortable middle ground, one that required constant negotiation. Nico navigated it quietly, aware that attention could be as dangerous as dismissal. At home, life began to settle into a new rhythm. The tension that followed him through the door each night slowly eased. He slept more deeply, though not without moments of wakefulness when memory intruded. His wife noticed a change before he did, commenting on the way his shoulders no longer carried the same weight. He realized then how much he'd been holding back, how the act of speaking had released something he had not fully recognized. The cost had been real, but so had the relief. He allowed himself to acknowledge that without guilt. One evening, his son asked him why people at school sometimes laughed at accents. The question caught Nico off guard, its simplicity cutting through years of practiced restraint. He answered honestly, explaining how misunderstanding often masked fear and how silence could be both a refuge and a trap. His son listened intently, absorbing more than the words themselves. Nico felt a quiet resolve take shape, the understanding that the story he had lived was not his alone. It had already begun to echo forward, shaping someone else's sense of possibility. The realization grounded him in a way nothing else had. At work, Laura eventually left the company, her departure announced with polite gratitude. Nico never learned where she went next, only that she had chosen movement over stasis. He respected that choice, recognizing its courage. Their final exchange was a brief message wishing him well, devoid of sentiment but heavy with shared understanding. Nico saved it, not as evidence, but as acknowledgement. It was enough. Time passed, and the intensity of the moment receded into something quieter but more durable. Nico found himself reflecting less on what might have been and more on what had changed. He understood now that resolution did not always arrive as recognition. Sometimes it manifested as absence, the absence of harm, the absence of silence enforced by fear. That understanding reshaped his sense of closure. He no longer needed an audience to validate his decision. The impact existed regardless. Still, there were moments when doubt resurfaced, when he wondered if he had sacrificed too much for too little. Those moments passed more quickly now, countered by the memory of the room, the laughter, the assumption that he did not understand. He remembered the choice he had made, the clarity it had brought. The doubt never disappeared entirely, but it no longer controlled him. He had learned to live with unresolved edges. One afternoon, as Nico prepared to leave, a new worker approached him, hesitant and soft-spoken. She asked him quietly how to report concern, without drawing attention to herself. Nico listened carefully, recognizing familiar fear behind her words. He explained the options, emphasizing documentation and timing, offering what guidance he could without exposing himself or her. As she thanked him, Nico felt the weight of the moment settle differently. The story was continuing, not through him alone, but through the choices of others. That realization lingered with him as he walked out into the evening. The question no longer whether he had spoken too late, but how many had been waiting for someone to speak at all. The months that followed carried a quieter weight, the kind that settled into Nico's days without demanding attention. The workplace no longer felt hostile, but it also never returned to its former neutrality. There was an awareness now, a shared understanding that certain lines existed even if no one named them. Nico moved through his tasks with steady focus, no longer shrinking himself to fit expectations, yet not seeking prominence either. He had found a narrow balance between presence and restraint. That balance required constant adjustment, but it felt honest. He understood now that integrity was not a single act, but a posture maintained over time. Occasionally, someone would test him with a careless comment or a joke edged with old assumptions. Nico responded calmly, neither confronting nor accommodating, allowing discomfort to do its work. Those moments no longer tightened his chest the way they once had. He had learned that silence chosen freely carried a different authority than silence imposed. The distinction gave him room to breathe. He noticed that fewer people laughed along when those comments surfaced. The shift was subtle, but it mattered. At home, conversations deepened in ways he had not anticipated. His wife asked more about his childhood, about the choices that had shaped his instinct to wait rather than react. Nico found himself answering with more openness than he expected, discovering that some memories lost their sharpness when spoken aloud. Sharing did not weaken them. It clarified them. He realized how much of his life he had carried alone, mistaking self-containment for strength. Letting someone else witness that history felt risky, but also necessary. It reminded him that endurance did not have to be solitary. His son watched him differently now, with a curiosity that bordered on admiration. Nico was careful not to turn himself into a lesson or a symbol. Instead, he focused on consistency, on showing that values were lived quietly rather than announced. When his son asked difficult questions, Nico answered without simplification, trusting him with complexity. He wanted his child to understand that courage did not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looked like patience that knew when to end. At work, a formal recognition program was introduced, celebrating employee voices in carefully curated ways. Nico was never nominated, and he did not expect to be. Still, seeing the initiative stirred something unresolved in him. He wondered how many stories would be reshaped to fit the narrative of openness while preserving the comfort of power. The thought did not embitter him, but it sharpened his awareness. Progress, he had learned, was often accompanied by amnesia. Remembering became its own responsibility. One afternoon, Nico received an anonymous note through the internal system. It was brief, thanking him for making the place safer and apologizing for not speaking up sooner. The message carried no identifying details, only sincerity. Nico read it several times, surprised by the emotion it stirred. He realized then that impact did not always travel in visible lines. Sometimes it moved quietly, carried by people who had needed proof before trusting themselves. The note stayed with him longer than any official acknowledgement could have. He thought again of the meeting, of the laughter that had sparked everything. The memory no longer burned the way it once had. It felt distant, contextualized by what followed. Nico understood that the men in that room would likely never reflect on the moment the way he had. That asymmetry no longer troubled him. Closure, he realized, did not require shared understanding. It required alignment with oneself. As time continued to pass, Nico felt the story of what he had done begin to settle into something less urgent but more enduring. It became part of how he saw the world, part of how he measured risk and responsibility. He no longer asked himself whether speaking had been worth it. That question had dissolved, replaced by a quieter certainty. He had acted when the waiting no longer served its purpose. That was enough. One evening, as he walked home under a sky just beginning to darken, Nico considered how easily his silence had once been mistaken for ignorance. He understood now how deliberate that misunderstanding had been, how convenient it was for others. The knowledge no longer felt heavy. It felt instructive. Some truths survived only because someone carried them long enough to know when to release them. Nico sensed that his story was nearing its final shape, not as an ending, but as a handoff. The question that remained was not why he had waited to speak, but who would choose to speak next. Years later, the building looked the same from the outside, its glass reflecting the city, without revealing what had once passed inside. Nico stood across the street one afternoon, waiting for his son, who now worked nearby, to finish his shift. The coincidence was not lost on him, though he did not mention it. Time had softened many things, but it had not erased memory. Nico could still recall the exact cadence of the laughter, the way his name had landed in the room like something disposable. What had changed was how that memory lived inside him. It no longer defined him, but it still instructed him. His son joined him, older now, carrying his own version of quiet observation. They spoke casually about work, about plans for dinner, about nothing that carried weight on its surface. Yet Nico sensed the unspoken connection between their worlds, the invisible thread of experience that linked them. His son mentioned a conversation he had overheard that day, a small injustice framed as humor. Nico listened without interruption, recognizing familiar tension in the story. He did not rush to advise or correct. He understood that the choice to speak could not be borrowed. It had to be owned. As they walked, Nico remembered how close he had come to never saying anything at all, how easy it would have been to keep surviving quietly, to let the moment pass as so many others had. The system would have continued unchanged, the laughter repeated, the shortcuts taken until someone else paid the price. That version of his life still felt real enough to touch. He wondered briefly who he would have been if he had chosen it. The thought passed without regret. The truth was simpler than he had once believed. He had waited not out of fear, but out of preparation, even if he had not named it that way at the time. Every silence had taught him something about people, about power, about timing. When he finally spoke, it was not to defend himself, but to interrupt a pattern. That distinction mattered more now than ever. He understood that speaking too early could be dismissed, and speaking too late could be meaningless. The moment he had chosen had been neither. It had been exact. They stopped at a crosswalk, the city moving around them with practiced indifference. Nico watched his son's face as the light changed, seeing traces of his own younger self there. He felt a quiet responsibility settle in him, not to shield his son from difficulty, but to trust him with the truth of how change actually happened. He told him, simply, that understanding was never the problem. The problem was deciding what to do with it. His son nodded, absorbing the words without drama. Nico felt something loosen inside him. Later that night, alone in the quiet of his home, Nico reflected on how little of what he'd done had ever been recorded. There were no headlines, no acknowledgments, no official story that named him. And yet the impact had rippled outward, carried by people who felt safer, who asked questions, who chose to notice. He realized then that stories did not need recognition to survive. They needed witnesses willing to hold them honestly. He had been one, briefly, when it mattered most. Nico no longer worked in that building, nor did he need to. His life had expanded beyond its walls, shaped by choices that had once seemed impossibly heavy. The silence he carried now was lighter, filled with intention rather than suppression. He could enter rooms as himself, without calculation, without waiting. That freedom had been earned slowly, patiently, at a cost he accepted. He did not miss the man he used to be, but he respected him when he thought back to that day, to the moment his grip had tightened on the tool. He no longer felt the surge of anger that had once threatened to overwhelm him. He felt clarity. He had known exactly why he was waiting, even if he had not been able to articulate it then. He had been waiting for the moment when speaking would mean something beyond his own survival. That moment had come, and he had answered it. The question had never been whether he understood. It had been whether he would choose to be understood. Some stories endure because they are loud, repeated until they cannot be ignored. Others survive only because someone chooses to tell them once, at the right time, to the right person, and then lets them move quietly through the world. Nico's story was the second kind. It did not demand attention, but it changed what it touched. And long after the laughter faded, that choice continued to matter. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the most lasting truths.